The frozen lake stretched endlessly beneath the crippled aircraft, its surface gleaming like a mirror of death. Sarah Thompson gripped the controls of the massive C-130 as warning alarms screamed around her. 2 engines dead, hydraulics failing, and 43 souls depending on her to do something that every flight manual said was impossible. Land a 130,000-pound aircraft on ice that might not hold, with no runway lights, no ground support, and visibility measured in mere feet. The same hands that had been deemed too cautious and insufficiently aggressive by 2 different flight schools now held the lives of senators, generals, and crew members. In 30 seconds, she would either prove that sometimes the person everyone gives up on is exactly the person everyone needs, or she would become another cautionary tale about why some people just aren't meant to fly. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Thompson stepped off the military transport bus at Whitmore Air Force Base with a determination that masked the uncertainty churning in her stomach. The Alaskan wind cut through her regulation jacket like a blade, carrying with it the scent of jet fuel and the promise of another chance that she couldn't afford to waste. Around her, the other new arrivals moved with the confident swagger of pilots who had never known failure, their conversation peppered with stories of perfect check rides and instructor praise. Sarah listened to them discuss their civilian flight hours and college aviation programs while she shouldered her worn flight bag, the same one that had carried her dreams through 2 devastating rejections. The base itself was a testament to military precision carved into the unforgiving Alaskan wilderness. Concrete runways stretched across the tundra like scars, while massive hangars housed the aircraft that made Arctic operations possible. This was Whitmore Air Force Base, home to the most challenging pilot training program in the military, where the weather was as much an enemy as any foreign adversary, and where only the strongest survived to earn their wings. The Arctic Operations Pilot Training Program had a washout rate that made other military schools look gentle by comparison, but it also produced pilots capable of flying in conditions that would ground aircraft anywhere else in the world. Jake Mitchell was holding court near the flight line, his voice carrying across the group as he described his latest flying adventure. Everything about him screamed privilege and natural ability, from his perfectly pressed uniform to the expensive watch catching the Arctic sun. His father's position as an airline executive had opened doors that most pilots could only dream of, and his natural flying ability had carried him through every challenge with an ease that made instructors take notice. When he spotted Sarah approaching with her obviously well-used equipment, his expression shifted to that particular mixture of amusement and condescension that she had come to know too well. Well, Jake said, his voice pitched just loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. Looks like they're really scraping the bottom of the barrel for this class. Someone bring their grandmother's flight bag by mistake. The laughter that followed was immediate and cruel, the kind that bonded groups together through shared superiority over an obvious outsider. Sarah had heard variations of this joke before, at civilian flight school, where her methodical approach had been labeled overthinking, and at her first military training program, where her thorough pre-flight checks had been dismissed as wasting time. She didn't respond to Jake's comment, instead focusing on unpacking her flight materials with the same careful attention she gave everything else. Her approach to flying had been shaped by years of crop dusting over the Montana plains, where a single mistake could mean the difference between landing safely in a farm field and becoming a crater in someone's wheat crop. Every item in her bag had a purpose and a place, from the worn checklist that had belonged to her grandfather to the detailed weather analysis charts she maintained by hand. While others relied on electronic systems and quick decisions, Sarah had learned to trust preparation and patience above all else. The other candidates were comparing their civilian flight experiences, and the differences were stark. Emily Chun, a quiet woman from California, had trained at one of the country's premier aviation academies, while Mark Stevens boasted about his time flying aerobatic competitions. Each story seemed designed to establish pecking order, and Sarah found herself near the bottom by every conventional measure. Her experience consisted mainly of agricultural flying in single-engine aircraft, hardly the kind of background that impressed military aviation instructors who valued speed and aggression over cautious methodology. Captain Linda Rodriguez emerged from the operations building to address the new arrivals, her stride and bearing marking her as someone who had earned her position through competence rather than politics. She carried herself with the quiet confidence of a pilot who had faced real emergencies and survived them, and her eyes swept over the assembled candidates with the calculating gaze of someone evaluating raw material for transformation. When she began to speak, her voice carried the authority of experience and the warning of challenges ahead. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Arctic Operations Pilot Training, where we separate the pilots from the passengers," Rodriguez announced. "The weather here doesn't care about your civilian flight hours, your college degrees, or your family connections. It will kill you without hesitation if you're not prepared for it. Our job is to make you into pilots capable of flying in conditions that would ground aircraft anywhere else in the world, and we're going to push you harder than you've ever been pushed before." She gestured toward the flight line where various aircraft sat ready for training missions. "You'll be flying T-38 Talons primarily, but you'll also get stick time in larger aircraft, including the C-130 Hercules. The Arctic environment presents unique challenges that require quick thinking, aggressive decision-making, and absolute confidence in your abilities. We don't have time for hesitation or second-guessing. When the weather closes in and you're flying a mission that people's lives depend on, you need to act fast and act right." Sarah felt a familiar tightness in her chest as Rodriguez outlined the program's philosophy. Quick thinking and aggressive decision-making were the exact qualities that had gotten her washed out of 2 previous programs. At civilian flight school, her instructor had written in her evaluation that she lacks the assertiveness necessary for modern aviation operations, while her military training had ended with the assessment that she was unsuited for high-pressure decision-making environments. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The emphasis on speed over deliberation seemed to follow her everywhere, as if the aviation world had collectively decided that thoughtful analysis was a liability rather than an asset. Colonel Robert Hayes, the program commander, joined Rodriguez on the small platform that had been set up for the orientation briefing. He was a legend in military aviation circles, a pilot who had flown combat missions in 3 different conflicts and survived situations that had become case studies in military academies. His presence alone was enough to command respect, and when he spoke, even Jake Mitchell stopped his casual commentary to listen. The Arctic Operations Pilot Training Program exists because regular pilot training isn't enough. Hayes began, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "We've learned through hard experience that pilots trained in temperate climates often struggle when faced with the unique challenges of Arctic operations. The weather changes faster than anywhere else on Earth. Navigation systems can fail without warning, and emergency landing options are limited to whatever flat ground you can find in a wilderness that stretches for hundreds of miles." He paused to let that sink in before continuing. "We're going to teach you to fly in conditions that most pilots never encounter, to make split-second decisions when lives are on the line, and to push your aircraft to the limits of their performance envelopes. Some of you won't make it through the program, and that's not a failure of the system. It's the system working exactly as designed. Better to wash out here than to fail when people are counting on you in the real world." As the briefing continued, Sarah noticed the way the other candidates responded to Hayes's words. Most seemed energized by the challenge, their body language suggesting confidence that they would be among those who succeeded. Jake Mitchell in particular appeared almost eager for the opportunity to demonstrate his superiority, while others took notes on the specific requirements and evaluation criteria. Sarah found herself focusing instead on the implications of what Hayes had said about emergency landing options and wilderness operations, areas where her agricultural flying background might actually provide advantages that others lacked. The tour of the facilities that followed the briefing revealed the scope and sophistication of the training program. The simulator complex housed equipment that could replicate every conceivable emergency scenario, from multiple engine failures to complete electrical system breakdowns. The weather monitoring station tracked conditions across a 1,000-mile radius, providing real-time data that would determine whether training flights could proceed safely. Most impressive of all was the maintenance facility, where teams of specialists kept the training aircraft in perfect condition, despite the harsh operating environment. Sarah found herself drawn to the maintenance hangar, where she watched technicians performing detailed inspections on a T-38 that had just returned from a training flight. The level of attention they paid to every system and component reminded her of the maintenance work she had done on her family's crop dusting operation, where a single overlooked problem could result in an emergency landing in terrain that offered no forgiveness for mistakes. The lead technician, Master Sergeant Bill Johnson, noticed her interest and approached with the kind of smile that suggested he appreciated finding someone who understood the importance of proper maintenance. Most pilot candidates walk through here without really seeing what we do, Johnson said, wiping his hands on a rag that had seen years of faithful service. They're too focused on the flying part to appreciate that their lives depend on the work we do down here in the hangar. You've got a different look about you, like you actually understand that maintenance isn't just about following checklists. Sarah nodded, remembering countless hours spent working on her grandfather's old Cessna, learning that understanding your aircraft's mechanical systems was just as important as knowing how to fly it. I grew up around aviation maintenance, she replied. My family operates crop dusters back in Montana, and we learned early that you don't trust your life to any aircraft you haven't personally inspected. Johnson's smile widened. That's exactly the kind of attitude that keeps pilots alive up here. The Arctic is unforgiving enough without adding mechanical failures to the mix. If you ever decide the pilot thing isn't working out, you'd make a hell of a maintenance officer. As the orientation day concluded and the candidates were assigned to their quarters, Sarah found herself in a familiar position. She was surrounded by people who seemed naturally suited for the challenges ahead, while she carried the burden of 2 previous failures and an approach to flying that consistently put her at odds with modern aviation training. The walls of her room in the officers' quarters seemed to close in as she unpacked her belongings, each item a reminder of dreams that had been deferred but not abandoned. That evening in the officers' club, the new candidates gathered for an informal meet and greet that felt more like a competition to establish social hierarchy. Jake Mitchell dominated the conversation, regaling anyone who would listen with stories of aerobatic maneuvers and close calls that he had navigated with apparent ease. Others contributed their own tales of aviation achievement, creating an atmosphere where experience was measured in risk-taking and natural ability rather than careful preparation and methodical skill development. Sarah sat at the edge of the group, nursing a soft drink and listening to the various stories being shared. When the conversation turned to previous training experiences, she found herself reluctant to contribute her own history of setbacks and disappointments. Instead, she focused on observing the group dynamics and trying to understand how she might find her place among pilots whose approach to flying seemed fundamentally different from her own. "What about you, Thompson?" Jake suddenly called out, turning the attention of the entire group toward her. "We've heard from everyone else, but you've been pretty quiet over there. What's your story? Where did you learn to fly?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Sarah felt the weight of all eyes on her as she considered how to respond. She could sense that her answer would shape how the group perceived her for the duration of the program, and she knew that honesty about her background might mark her as an outsider from the very beginning. But she had learned long ago that attempting to be someone she wasn't only led to greater problems down the road. "I learned to fly crop dusters on my family's ranch in Montana," she said simply. "Been flying agricultural operations for about 10 years, mostly single-engine aircraft working fields and dealing with the kind of weather that changes faster than you can plan for it." She paused before adding, "It's not the most glamorous flying, but it teaches you to be prepared for situations that don't go according to plan." The silence that followed her response was telling. Agricultural flying was considered by many military pilots to be a step above recreational flying, but well below the kind of challenging aviation that prepared someone for military operations. It was seen as routine, predictable work that didn't require the split-second decision-making, and aggressive flying that characterized modern military aviation training. Sarah could see the dismissive expressions on several faces, and she knew that she had just confirmed their initial assessment of her as someone who didn't belong in their elite program. Jake's response was predictable, but still cutting. "Crop dusting, huh? That's different. I guess someone has to do the agricultural work, but it's a pretty big jump from flying over wheat fields to Arctic military operations. Hope you're ready for some real challenges." The laughter that followed was polite but unmistakably condescending, the kind that suggested her fellow candidates had already written her off as someone unlikely to complete the program successfully. As the evening wound down and the candidates began retiring to their quarters, Sarah walked alone across the base under the strange twilight that characterized Alaskan summer nights. The Arctic air was crisp and clean, carrying sounds farther than seemed possible in the vast wilderness that surrounded Whitmore Air Force Base. She thought about her grandfather, who had taught her that flying was as much about understanding weather and aircraft systems as it was about stick and rudder skills, and about her family's expectations that she would finally succeed in achieving the military aviation career that had eluded her twice before. Tomorrow would bring the beginning of actual training, with flights that would be evaluated according to criteria that emphasized speed and aggression over the careful, methodical approach that had shaped her flying style. She knew that she would once again be fighting against a system that valued qualities she didn't naturally possess while struggling to demonstrate that her own strengths had value in military aviation. The familiar weight of being an outsider settled over her shoulders as she prepared for another attempt to prove that sometimes the person who doesn't fit the mold is exactly the person the mold needs to change to accommodate. The morning briefing room buzzed with nervous energy as the new pilot candidates gathered for their first day of actual flight training. Sarah Thompson sat near the back, her notebook already open to a fresh page where she had documented the overnight weather changes and wind patterns she had observed during her early morning walk around the flight line. The Alaskan dawn had brought with it shifting conditions that would affect aircraft performance, details that most of her fellow candidates seemed to have overlooked in their eagerness to finally get airborne. Jake Mitchell dominated the front row with his usual confidence, his flight suit crisp and new, every piece of equipment positioned exactly according to regulation. He had spent the previous evening in the officers' club regaling anyone who would listen with stories of his civilian aerobatic experience, emphasizing his natural ability to adapt quickly to new aircraft and challenging conditions. His followers, a small group of candidates who had gravitated toward his obvious leadership qualities, hung on his every word as he predicted how the day's training would unfold. Captain Rodriguez entered the briefing room with the purposeful stride of an instructor who had delivered this particular lesson hundreds of times before. Behind her came Lieutenant Stevens, a young officer whose job was to coordinate the day's flight schedule and ensure that each candidate received equal opportunity to demonstrate their capabilities. The morning's agenda was posted on the whiteboard, showing a series of basic proficiency flights designed to establish baseline competency levels for each pilot candidate. Today we begin the actual evaluation process, Rodriguez announced, her voice cutting through the morning chatter. Each of you will fly a basic proficiency check ride in the T-38 Talon, demonstrating fundamental flying skills that we expect every military pilot to possess. The emphasis will be on aircraft handling, navigation accuracy, and your ability to respond quickly to simulated emergency situations. She moved to the flight status board and began assigning aircraft tail numbers to specific candidates. The evaluation criteria are straightforward. We're looking for smooth aircraft control, rapid response to instructions, and decisive action when presented with emergency scenarios. The weather conditions today are marginal but acceptable for training, with variable winds and occasional snow showers that will test your ability to adapt to changing conditions. Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest as Rodriguez outlined the evaluation standards. Rapid response and decisive action were precisely the areas where her previous instructors had found her lacking. Her tendency to thoroughly analyze situations before acting had been characterized as hesitation, while her careful attention to weather conditions had been dismissed as overthinking. She made notes in her book about the specific evaluation criteria, knowing that she would need to find ways to demonstrate competence within a system that seemed designed to reward qualities she struggled to exhibit. Jake raised his hand with the casual confidence of someone accustomed to being the center of attention. "Captain Rodriguez, what kind of emergency scenarios should we expect today? I've dealt with most standard emergencies in civilian training, so I'm wondering if you'll be throwing anything particularly challenging at us." Rodriguez smiled with the expression of an instructor who had heard similar questions from overconfident students many times before. "Mitchell, I can guarantee that you haven't experienced anything in civilian training that compares to what we'll present today. Arctic flying presents unique challenges that most pilots never encounter, and our emergency scenarios are designed to test your ability to think quickly when your standard procedures don't apply." The aircraft assignments were posted, and Sarah found herself assigned to tail number 847, a T-38 that appeared to be one of the older aircraft in the fleet. As the candidates moved toward the flight line for pre-flight inspections, she overheard Jake commenting to his followers about the apparent randomness of aircraft assignments, suggesting that instructors might deliberately assign less capable aircraft to candidates they expected to struggle. "Typical," Jake said, loud enough for Sarah to hear as she collected her flight gear. "They probably gave Thompson the hangar queen because they're expecting her to wash out anyway. At least when she fails, they can blame it on equipment problems instead of admitting they let someone unqualified into the program." Sarah ignored the comment and focused instead on the task ahead. She had learned from her agricultural flying experience that every aircraft had its own personality and quirks, and that understanding those characteristics was often more important than flying the newest or best-maintained machine. Her grandfather had taught her that a pilot who could make an old aircraft perform well was more valuable than one who needed perfect equipment to succeed. The pre-flight inspection of aircraft 847 revealed exactly what Sarah expected from an older training aircraft. The control surfaces showed the wear patterns of thousands of training flights, and several instruments displayed the slight inaccuracies that came with age and heavy use. Rather than seeing these as problems, Sarah methodically documented each characteristic, understanding that knowing her aircraft's specific quirks would give her advantages during the actual flight evaluation. Master Sergeant Johnson appeared at her shoulder as she completed the inspection, his experienced eye taking in her thorough approach to the pre-flight process. "Most candidates spend about 10 minutes on pre-flight," he observed. "You've been out here for almost 30. Find something wrong with my aircraft?" Sarah looked up from her checklist with a slight smile. "Nothing wrong, Sergeant. Just making sure I understand how this particular bird behaves. The left aileron has a slight binding issue that affects control response, and the attitude indicator has about a 2-degree bias that could affect instrument approaches. Nothing dangerous, just characteristics I need to account for during flight." Johnson nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the kind of attention to detail that keeps pilots alive up here. Most of these hotshots would rather spend their time talking about their flying abilities than actually understanding their aircraft. You might actually make it through this program if you can convince the instructors that thorough preparation isn't the same thing as being slow." The comment struck closer to home than Johnson probably realized. Sarah's thoroughness had consistently been interpreted as slowness by her previous instructors, who seemed to believe that quick decisions were inherently superior to well-informed decisions. She had never understood the logic of rushing through preparation in order to demonstrate readiness for situations where lives would depend on making the right choice rather than the fast choice. Jake Mitchell's pre-flight inspection was completed in record time, his confidence evident as he strapped into his assigned aircraft with the casual ease of someone who believed that natural flying ability could overcome any mechanical shortcomings. His followers had gathered to watch his preparation process, clearly hoping to learn from someone who seemed to embody everything the program valued in pilot candidates. "Watch and learn," Jake called out to his audience as he started his engines and prepared for taxi. "This is how you handle military aircraft when you actually know what you're doing." The morning's flight evaluations began with Jake leading the formation takeoff, his aircraft lifting off the runway with textbook precision. Sarah followed in the number 4 position, her older T-38 requiring slightly more attention to maintain proper formation spacing and altitude. The Alaskan landscape spread beneath them like a wilderness canvas, vast and unforgiving in its beauty, marked by mountains and valleys that offered few options for emergency landings. Captain Rodriguez's voice crackled through the radio with instructions for the first evaluation exercise, a series of precision maneuvers designed to test basic aircraft handling skills. Execute a 360-degree turn to the left, maintaining altitude within 50 feet and rolling out on your original heading within 5 degrees. Begin the maneuver on my mark. Jake's aircraft rolled into the turn with aggressive bank angles and smooth control inputs, completing the maneuver several seconds faster than the other candidates. His radio call was crisp and confident, reporting altitude and heading with the precision of someone who had performed similar exercises countless times before. The instructor's response was appropriately positive, acknowledging good aircraft control and proper radio procedures. Sarah approached the same maneuver with her characteristic methodical style, taking time to set up the turn properly and monitoring her instruments throughout the evolution. Her aircraft's slight control quirks required minor adjustments to maintain the specified parameters, but her thorough pre-flight preparation allowed her to compensate effectively. When she rolled out of the turn, her altitude and heading were precisely on target, though she had taken longer to complete the maneuver than the other candidates. "Thompson, your aircraft control is acceptable, but you need to pick up the pace," came Rodriguez's voice over the radio. "Military flying requires the ability to execute maneuvers quickly and decisively. Take too long analyzing every situation and you'll find yourself behind the aircraft instead of ahead of it." The criticism was familiar and stung with the recognition of a pattern that had followed Sarah through every training program she had attempted. Her accurate execution of the maneuver seemed less important to the instructors than the speed with which she had completed it, reinforcing her growing understanding that the military aviation system valued quick action over careful precision. The emergency scenarios that followed were designed to test each candidate's ability to respond rapidly to simulated equipment failures and dangerous situations. Jake handled a simulated engine failure with textbook procedure execution, immediately. Configuring his aircraft for single-engine flight and heading toward the nearest suitable airfield. His radio calls were clear and decisive, demonstrating exactly the kind of quick thinking that military aviation instructors wanted to see from pilot candidates. When Sarah's turn came for emergency evaluation, she was presented with a more complex scenario involving multiple system failures during simulated instrument conditions. Her response followed established procedures, but she took additional time to verify system status and consider alternative options before committing to a specific course of action. Her thoroughness ensured that she correctly identified all aspects of the simulated emergency, but her methodical approach consumed precious seconds that the instructors clearly viewed as excessive hesitation. Thompson, in a real emergency situation, you won't have the luxury of extended analysis time. Rodriguez's voice carried a note of frustration. When systems start failing, you need to take immediate action based on your training and experience. Spending too much time thinking about your options can turn a manageable emergency into a catastrophic situation. The pattern continued throughout the morning's evaluation flights, with Sarah consistently demonstrating accurate flying skills and thorough understanding of aircraft systems while struggling to meet the program's expectations for rapid decision-making and aggressive flying techniques. Each exercise reinforced the growing perception among instructors and fellow candidates that she possessed the technical knowledge necessary for military flying but lacked the decisive personality traits that characterize successful military pilots. During the post-flight debriefing, the candidates gathered in the briefing room for individual performance reviews and group discussion of the morning's lessons. Jake Mitchell's evaluation was overwhelmingly positive, with instructors praising his natural flying abilities and quick adaptation to military procedures. Several other candidates received similarly encouraging feedback, establishing them as front-runners in the competitive program environment. Sarah's debriefing was more complicated, reflecting the instructor's ambivalence about her performance. Captain Rodriguez acknowledged her technical proficiency and thorough understanding of aircraft systems while expressing concern about her decision-making speed and overall aggressiveness in handling challenging situations. Thompson, your flying skills are technically sound, and you clearly understand aircraft systems better than most candidates, Rodriguez began. However, military aviation requires pilots who can make quick decisions under pressure and execute those decisions with confidence. Your tendency to overthink situations could be a significant liability in operational environments where hesitation can have fatal consequences. She paused before continuing with what sounded like a prepared speech. I'm not failing you based on today's performance, but I need to see significant improvement in your decision-making speed and overall assertiveness. Military pilots need to trust their training and act decisively when faced with emergency situations. The feedback was discouraging but not entirely unexpected. Sarah had heard similar criticisms throughout her flying career, always delivered with the implication that her careful approach to aviation was fundamentally incompatible with military requirements. She made detailed notes about the specific areas where improvement was expected, though she struggled to understand how rushing through critical decisions could possibly improve flight safety. Jake's post-flight celebration in the Officers Club that evening was attended by most of the candidate class, creating an informal social hierarchy based on the day's performance evaluations. His confident predictions about future training had proven accurate, and his natural leadership qualities were attracting followers who hoped to benefit from his obvious favor with the instructional staff. The key to military flying is confidence, Jake explained to his audience, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had just demonstrated superior performance. You can't second-guess yourself when lives are on the line. The instructors want to see pilots who trust their training and act decisively when situations get challenging. Sarah sat at the edge of the group, listening to Jake's analysis while reflecting on the fundamental differences between his approach to flying and her own. His emphasis on confidence and quick decision-making clearly aligned with the program's values, while her methodical style seemed increasingly out of place in an environment that prized speed over deliberation. Emily Chun, one of the quieter candidates who had performed reasonably well during the day's evaluations, approached Sarah's table with a sympathetic expression. "Rough feedback session today," she said, settling into a chair across from Sarah. "Rodriguez can be pretty direct when she thinks someone isn't meeting expectations." Sarah nodded, appreciating the gesture of support from someone who understood the pressure of trying to succeed in a highly competitive environment. "I'm starting to think that my approach to flying just doesn't fit what they're looking for in military pilots," she admitted. "Every instructor I've worked with wants to see more aggression and faster decision-making, but that's never been how I operate aircraft." Emily considered this before responding. "Maybe the problem isn't your flying style, but the way you're presenting it to the instructors. Military aviation has a culture that values certain personality traits, but that doesn't necessarily mean those traits make for better pilots. You just need to find a way to demonstrate your capabilities within their framework." The conversation was interrupted by Jake's increasingly loud commentary about the day's training, his confidence having grown with each drink and each admiring comment from his followers. "Some people just aren't cut out for military flying," he declared, his voice carrying clearly across the room. "It takes a special kind of person to handle the pressure and make split-second decisions when everything is falling apart around you." His words were clearly directed toward Sarah, though he maintained the pretense of general commentary about military aviation requirements. The implication was obvious to everyone present, and Sarah felt the familiar sting of being publicly dismissed by someone whose natural abilities seemed to make everything she struggled with appear effortless. The following days brought a series of increasingly challenging flight evaluations, each designed to test different aspects of military flying competency. Navigation exercises required candidates to fly precise routes while managing radio communications and responding to changing weather conditions. Air-to-air intercept training demanded quick reactions and aggressive maneuvering to successfully complete simulated combat scenarios. Sarah's performance followed a consistent pattern of technical competence, coupled with concerns about her decision-making speed and overall aggressiveness. She could execute complex maneuvers with precision and demonstrate thorough understanding of aircraft systems, but she consistently required more time than other candidates to process information and commit to specific courses of action. Jake Mitchell, meanwhile, continued to excel in every area that the instructors valued most highly. His natural flying abilities allowed him to adapt quickly to new aircraft and challenging scenarios, while his confident personality projected exactly the kind of decisive leadership that military aviation prized. His performance evaluations consistently ranked him among the top candidates in the program, making him an obvious choice for advanced training opportunities. The contrast between their approaches became most apparent during a complex navigation exercise that required candidates to fly a multi-leg route while dealing with changing weather conditions and simulated equipment failures. Jake completed the exercise with impressive speed, making quick decisions about route modifications and demonstrating the kind of adaptability that instructors wanted to see from military pilots. Sarah's approach to the same exercise was characteristically methodical, taking time to thoroughly analyze weather data and calculate precise navigation solutions for each leg of the route. Her final performance was technically superior to Jake's, with more accurate navigation and better fuel management, but her completion time was significantly slower than what the instructors considered acceptable for military operations. Thompson: "Your navigation accuracy is excellent, but you're taking too long to make basic decisions about route planning and weather avoidance," Captain Rodriguez explained during the post-flight debriefing. In operational environments, you won't have the luxury of extended analysis time. You need to develop the ability to make good decisions quickly, even when you don't have perfect information. The feedback reinforced Sarah's growing understanding that technical competence alone would not be sufficient to succeed in the program. The military aviation system seemed designed to reward personality traits that she struggled to exhibit, while treating her natural strengths as potential liabilities. That needed to be corrected rather than developed. As the training progressed into its third week, the pressure intensified with the introduction of more complex scenarios and higher performance standards. Candidates who failed to meet expectations were given additional training opportunities, but everyone understood that these were essentially last chances to demonstrate suitability for military aviation careers. Sarah found herself increasingly isolated from the main group of candidates, who had naturally gravitated toward Jake's confident leadership and easy camaraderie with the instructional staff. Her methodical approach to training and careful attention to aircraft systems marked her as different from the aggressive, quick-thinking pilots that the program was designed to produce. The breaking point came during a particularly challenging formation flying exercise that required candidates to maintain precise positioning while executing complex maneuvers in deteriorating weather conditions. Jake led the formation with his characteristic confidence, making quick decisions about formation adjustments and communication procedures that kept the group together despite challenging conditions. Sarah struggled to maintain formation position while processing the rapid series of radio calls and formation changes that Jake was directing. Her aircraft's control quirks, which she had learned to manage during individual flights, became more problematic when combined with the need to respond quickly to formation leader instructions. When she fell behind during a particularly aggressive turn, her delayed response disrupted the entire formation's timing and forced an early termination of the exercise. The post-flight debriefing was brutal in its directness. Colonel Hayes himself attended the session, his presence indicating that Sarah's performance had attracted attention from the highest levels of the program administration. His reputation as a demanding but fair evaluator provided little comfort as he reviewed the video footage of the failed formation exercise. "Thompson, your individual flying skills are adequate, but military aviation is fundamentally a team endeavor," Hayes began, his voice carrying the weight of authority and experience. "Formation flying requires pilots who can respond instantly to changing conditions and leader instructions. Your hesitation during today's exercise endangered the entire formation and demonstrated exactly the kind of indecisiveness that we cannot tolerate in operational environments." He paused to let the criticism sink in before continuing. "I've reviewed your performance throughout the program, and while your technical knowledge is impressive, your inability to make quick decisions under pressure represents a fundamental incompatibility with military aviation requirements. I'm recommending that you be eliminated from the program and reassigned to duties more suitable to your methodical approach." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, confirming her worst fears about her future in military aviation. The careful preparation and thorough understanding of aircraft systems that she had always considered her greatest strengths were being dismissed as an adequate compensation for her failure to exhibit the quick thinking, aggressiveness that military flying demanded. Jake's reaction to the news was predictably unsympathetic. "I hate to say I told you so," he commented to his followers that evening, his voice carrying clearly across the officers' club, "but some people just aren't cut out for military flying. Thompson's a nice enough person, but she doesn't have the killer instinct that you need to succeed in this business." The elimination from pilot training felt like the final confirmation of what Sarah had begun to suspect throughout her aviation career. Her approach to flying, shaped by years of agricultural operations where careful preparation and methodical decision-making were valued over speed and aggression, seemed fundamentally incompatible with modern military aviation culture. As she prepared for reassignment to non-flying duties, Sarah reflected on the pattern of failures that had marked her attempts to pursue military aviation. Each program had emphasized the same qualities that she struggled to demonstrate, while treating her natural strengths as weaknesses that needed to be overcome rather than abilities that might have value in different contexts. The reassignment orders, when they finally arrived, directed her to report to the base maintenance section under Master Sergeant Johnson's supervision. It was a position that utilized her technical knowledge of aircraft systems while removing her from the flying duties that she had pursued for so many years. The irony was not lost on her that the same attention to detail that had been criticized during flight training was exactly what made her valuable in aircraft maintenance operations. Johnson welcomed her to the maintenance section with the practical attitude of someone who valued competence over personality traits. "Thompson, I've been watching your work since you arrived here, and I can tell you that we need people who understand aircraft systems the way you do. Flying isn't the only way to serve in military aviation, and sometimes the people who don't fit the pilot mold are exactly what we need in other critical positions." His words provided some comfort, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was settling for a compromise rather than pursuing the career she had always dreamed of achieving. The maintenance section offered opportunities to work with aircraft and contribute to military aviation, but it represented the end of her aspirations to become a military pilot rather than the beginning of a new phase in her aviation career. The first months of maintenance duty provided Sarah with unprecedented access to aircraft performance data and maintenance records that revealed patterns invisible to most pilots. Her methodical approach to documentation and analysis, which had been criticized during flight training, proved invaluable in identifying subtle trends that could affect aircraft reliability and safety. Working closely with Master Sergeant Johnson, Sarah developed a comprehensive understanding of how aircraft performance degraded under the demanding conditions of Arctic operations. The extreme cold, variable weather, and challenging terrain placed stresses on aircraft systems that were not encountered in more temperate environments, requiring maintenance approaches that went beyond standard procedures. Her detailed analysis of maintenance records revealed concerning patterns in aircraft reliability that seemed to correlate with the program's emphasis on aggressive flying techniques. Pilots who consistently pushed aircraft to their performance limits were experiencing higher rates of certain types of mechanical problems, suggesting that the training philosophy might be contributing to maintenance issues that could compromise safety. The discovery was troubling, but consistent with Sarah's growing understanding that the program's focus on speed and aggression might be creating problems that were not immediately apparent to instructors and administrators who measured success primarily through training completion rates and pilot confidence levels. As she compiled her analysis into a comprehensive report, Sarah realized that her unique perspective as both a failed pilot candidate and a maintenance specialist might provide insights that were not available to others within the program structure. Her understanding of both flying operations and aircraft systems allowed her to identify connections that might be invisible to people who worked exclusively on one side of military aviation or the other. The question was whether anyone in the program's leadership would be willing to listen to observations from someone who had already been judged unsuitable for military flying, or whether her insights would be dismissed as the complaints of a failed candidate looking for reasons to criticize a system that had rejected her. The notification came through official channels 3 days after her elimination from the pilot program, delivered by a stone-faced administrative clerk who seemed uncomfortable with the task. Sarah Thompson's reassignment orders were brief and clinical, directing her to report to aircraft maintenance operations under the supervision of Master Sergeant Johnson, effective immediately. The transition from officer candidate to enlisted support personnel represented more than just a career change. It was a fundamental shift in status that would affect every aspect of her life at Whitmore Air Force Base. The walk from the officers' quarters to the maintenance section felt like a journey between two different worlds. Behind her lay the flight line where pilot candidates continued their training, their aircraft taking off and landing in the endless cycle of instruction and evaluation that would determine their futures. Ahead lay the maintenance hangars where the real work of keeping aircraft operational happened, away from the glory and recognition that accompanied flying duties. Master Sergeant Johnson was waiting for her at the maintenance section entrance, his weathered face showing the kind of understanding that came from years of dealing with personnel transitions and disappointed expectations. He had seen other pilot candidates make this same journey, carrying their shattered dreams and wounded pride into assignments that required them to rebuild their sense of purpose and professional identity. "Thompson, welcome to the world of people who actually keep aircraft flying," Johnson said, his tone carrying neither sympathy nor condescension. "I know this isn't what you planned when you came to Whitmore, but I can tell you that what we do here is just as important as what happens in those cockpits. Pilots get the headlines, but maintenance personnel prevent the crashes." He led her through the massive hangar complex where teams of specialists worked on various aircraft in different stages of maintenance and repair. The scale of the operation was impressive, with sophisticated diagnostic equipment and precision tools that represented millions of dollars in specialized capability. Every aircraft that flew from Whitmore Air Force Base depended on the expertise and attention to detail of the people working in these hangars. "Your background in agricultural aviation actually gives you advantages that most people coming into maintenance don't have," Johnson continued as they walked past a T-38 undergoing engine replacement. "You understand how weather and operating conditions affect aircraft systems, and you've had to troubleshoot problems without access to elaborate support infrastructure. Those skills translate directly to what we do here." Sarah found herself assigned to the analysis section, a specialized unit responsible for tracking aircraft performance trends and identifying patterns that might indicate developing problems. The work required exactly the kind of methodical attention to detail that had been criticized during her flight training, combined with analytical skills that could transform raw maintenance data into actionable intelligence for keeping aircraft operational. Her first assignment involved reviewing maintenance records for the T-38 fleet, looking for correlations between operating conditions and component failure rates. The data revealed patterns that were invisible to casual observation, but became clear when subjected to systematic analysis. Aircraft operated in certain weather conditions showed higher rates of specific types of problems, while pilots with particular flying styles generated different maintenance requirements than others. The work was intellectually challenging, surprisingly engaging, requiring her to understand not just what was happening to aircraft systems, but why those problems were occurring and how they might be prevented. Her agricultural flying background provided insights into how environmental conditions affected aircraft performance, while her recent flight training experience helped her understand the operational context in which maintenance problems developed. Jake Mitchell's reaction to her new assignment was predictably dismissive when he encountered her in the base exchange several days after her reassignment. He was surrounded by his usual group of admirers, pilot candidates who had survived the latest round of evaluations and seemed confident about their prospects for completing the program successfully. Well, if it isn't our former pilot candidate," Jake said, his voice carrying just enough volume to ensure that nearby personnel could hear his comments. "I heard you found your true calling in aircraft maintenance. Probably a much better fit for someone with your particular skill set." His followers laughed at the implied insult, understanding that maintenance duty was considered a significant step down from pilot training in the military aviation hierarchy. The comment was designed to reinforce Jake's position as someone who belonged in the elite pilot community while highlighting Sarah's failure to meet the standards required for military flying. Sarah ignored the provocation and continued with, Her business, having learned that responding to Jake's comments only encouraged further harassment. Her new position in maintenance gave her a different perspective on the base's operations, and she was beginning to understand that the rigid hierarchy that placed pilots at the top of the military aviation structure might not accurately reflect the relative importance of different roles in keeping aircraft operational. The maintenance section's daily routine was structured around aircraft availability requirements and scheduled maintenance intervals, creating a demanding environment where problems needed to be identified and resolved quickly to maintain operational readiness. Sarah's analytical work supported these efforts by providing early warning of developing trends that might affect aircraft reliability or safety. Her first major discovery came while reviewing maintenance records for aircraft involved in the formation flying exercises that had led to her elimination from pilot training. The data revealed that aircraft flown by particularly aggressive pilots showed higher rates of structural stress indicators, suggesting that certain flying techniques might be causing premature wear that could eventually lead to more serious problems. The pattern was subtle and would have been invisible without systematic analysis, but the correlation was statistically significant and potentially important for long-term aircraft reliability. Sarah documented her findings in a detailed report that included recommendations for enhanced monitoring of aircraft subjected to aggressive maneuvering and suggested modifications to training procedures that might reduce unnecessary structural stress. Master Sergeant Johnson reviewed her analysis with the careful attention of someone who understood both the technical implications and the political sensitivities involved in questioning pilot training methods. Her findings were technically sound and based on solid data analysis, but they implicitly criticized the aggressive flying techniques that were central to the program's training philosophy. "This is good work, Thompson," Johnson said after reviewing her report. "You've identified a real problem that could affect aircraft safety if it's not addressed. The question is whether anyone in the program leadership will be willing to listen to maintenance concerns about training methods, especially coming from someone who was eliminated from pilot training." The challenge was significant, but not insurmountable. Military aviation had established procedures for raising safety concerns, and maintenance personnel were expected to identify and report problems, regardless of their potential impact on training operations. The key was presenting the findings in a way that focused on aircraft safety rather than appearing to criticize pilot training methods. Sarah spent additional time refining her analysis and gathering supporting data to strengthen her case. She identified specific aircraft that showed the most pronounced stress indicators and correlated those findings with pilot training records to establish clear connections between flying techniques and maintenance requirements. The evidence was compelling and difficult to dismiss as coincidence or statistical artifact. The formal presentation of her findings to the Maintenance Review Board was scheduled for the following week, providing an opportunity to present her analysis to senior personnel who could authorize changes in maintenance procedures or recommend modifications to training methods. The meeting would be her first chance to demonstrate that her analytical skills had value for military aviation, even if she had been judged unsuitable for flying duties. Jake Mitchell's training continued to progress smoothly, with consistently positive evaluations that marked him as one of the program's most successful candidates. His natural flying abilities and confident leadership style had earned him recognition as a potential instructor candidate, someone who might remain at Whitmore Air Force Base to train future pilot classes rather than proceeding directly to operational assignments. His success stood in stark contrast to Sarah's situation, reinforcing the program's assessment that quick-thinking, aggressive pilots were more valuable than methodical, analytical types who might overthink situations requiring immediate action. The difference in their career trajectories seemed to validate the military aviation system's emphasis on personality traits that Jake possessed and Sarah lacked. The Maintenance Review Board meeting was held in a conference room adjacent to the main hangar, with attendance by senior maintenance personnel and several flying operations representatives. Colonel Hayes himself was present, his participation indicating that Sarah's findings had attracted attention from the highest levels of base leadership. Sarah presented her analysis with the same methodical approach that had characterized her flying, walking the board through her methodology and explaining the statistical significance of her findings. The data showed clear correlations between aggressive flying techniques and accelerated aircraft wear, with specific recommendations for enhanced monitoring and potential modifications to training procedures. The response was mixed, with maintenance personnel expressing appreciation for the thorough analysis, while flying operations representatives questioned the implications for pilot training. The tension between operational requirements and maintenance concerns was evident in the discussion that followed Sarah's presentation. Colonel Hayes asked pointed questions about the data analysis methods and the statistical confidence levels associated with her findings. His questions were technically sophisticated and demonstrated a thorough understanding of both aircraft systems and data analysis techniques, suggesting that he was taking her findings seriously despite her status as a failed pilot candidate. "Thompson, your analysis appears to be technically sound, and the correlations you've identified are concerning from a long-term aircraft reliability perspective," Hayes said after reviewing her supporting documentation. "However, the flying techniques you're questioning are fundamental to our training philosophy and are based on operational requirements that go beyond simple aircraft longevity considerations." He paused before continuing with what appeared to be a carefully considered response. "I'm directing maintenance to implement your recommended enhanced monitoring procedures, and I want you to continue tracking these trends to see if they persist. As training progresses, we need to understand whether this is a temporary issue related to pilot experience levels or a fundamental problem with our training methods." The decision represented a partial victory for Sarah's analysis, acknowledging the validity of her findings while stopping short of questioning the training philosophy that had led to her elimination from pilot training. The enhanced monitoring procedures would provide additional data to either confirm or refute her concerns about the relationship between flying techniques and aircraft wear. Master Sergeant Johnson was pleased with the outcome, recognizing that getting any changes implemented based on maintenance recommendations was often difficult in an environment that prioritized operational requirements over long-term aircraft care. Sarah's analytical work had already proven valuable in identifying potential problems that might have gone unnoticed without systematic data analysis. The enhanced monitoring procedures revealed additional concerning trends as they were implemented. Over the following weeks, aircraft flown by the most aggressive pilots continued to show elevated stress indicators, while those operated by more conservative pilots maintained better structural condition, despite accumulating similar flight hours. Sarah documented these findings in regular reports that gradually built a compelling case for the relationship between flying techniques and aircraft longevity. Her work was gaining recognition within the maintenance community and attracting attention from aircraft manufacturers who were interested in understanding how operational procedures affected their products. The broader implications of her analysis extended beyond simple maintenance concerns to questions about the long-term sustainability of training methods that prioritize short-term performance over aircraft conservation. Military aviation operated under budget constraints that made aircraft longevity an important consideration, creating potential conflicts between training effectiveness and resource management. Jake Mitchell's awareness of Sarah's maintenance work was limited to occasional encounters where he made dismissive comments about people who worked on aircraft rather than flying them. His confidence in his own abilities and secure position within the pilot training program made him largely indifferent to concerns raised by maintenance personnel about flying techniques and aircraft care. The growing body of evidence that Sarah was accumulating would eventually require responses from program leadership that went beyond simple monitoring procedures. The data was becoming too compelling to ignore, and the potential safety implications were too significant to dismiss as minor maintenance concerns. Her position in the analysis section provided access to maintenance data from across the base's aircraft fleet, revealing patterns that extended beyond the pilot training program to operational aircraft flown by experienced pilots. The aggressive flying techniques taught in training appeared to carry over into operational flying, creating long-term maintenance burdens that affected the entire base's aircraft availability. The scope of the problem was larger than anyone had initially realized, involving not just training aircraft, but the entire fleet of aircraft operated from Whitmore Air Force Base. Sarah's analysis was uncovering systemic issues that had been developing for years without recognition, hidden within maintenance data that had never been subjected to the kind of comprehensive analysis she was conducting. The implications were staggering, suggesting that fundamental changes in flying techniques and training philosophy might be necessary to address aircraft longevity concerns that threatened the long-term viability of Arctic operations. The methodical, analytical approach that had been criticized during her flight training was revealing problems that had been invisible to the quick-thinking, aggressive pilots who dominated military aviation culture. Her work was attracting attention from beyond Whitmore Air Force Base, with aircraft manufacturers and military aviation researchers requesting copies of her analysis and recommendations. The recognition was gratifying but also concerning, as it highlighted the extent to which her findings challenged established practices throughout military aviation. The political implications of questioning fundamental training methods were significant, involving not just local program leadership, but military aviation policy at the highest levels. Sarah's analysis was becoming more than just a maintenance concern. It was evolving into a challenge to core assumptions about how military pilots should be trained and how aircraft should be operated. The transformation from failed pilot candidate to recognized analyst was unexpected but aligned with her natural strengths in systematic observation and methodical problem-solving. The same qualities that had been considered weaknesses during flight training were proving invaluable for identifying and analyzing complex problems that required patience and attention to detail. Master Sergeant Johnson recognized the significance of Sarah's contributions and was working to ensure that her findings received appropriate attention from decision-makers who could authorize the changes necessary to address the problems she had identified. The maintenance community was rallying behind her analysis, understanding that aircraft longevity directly affected their ability to maintain operational readiness with limited resources. The resistance from flying operations was predictable but concerning, reflecting institutional biases that prioritized pilot preferences over maintenance considerations. The cultural divide between pilots and maintenance personnel was evident in discussions about Sarah's findings, with each group interpreting the data through the lens of their own professional priorities and perspectives. Colonel Hayes found himself in the difficult position of balancing operational requirements against maintenance concerns, knowing that changes to training methods would face resistance from pilot instructors who believed that aggressive flying techniques were essential for combat readiness. The decision-making process was complicated by the fact that Sarah's analysis challenged fundamental assumptions about military aviation that had been accepted without question for decades. The growing recognition of her analytical capabilities was providing Sarah with opportunities to contribute to military aviation in ways that she had never considered during her pursuit of pilot training. Her unique perspective as someone who understood both flying operations and maintenance requirements was valuable for identifying problems that might be invisible to specialists who worked exclusively in one area or the other. The irony was not lost on her that elimination from pilot training had led to opportunities for making contributions to military aviation that might have been impossible if she had succeeded in becoming a pilot. Her analytical work was having impacts that extended far beyond anything she could have achieved as a single pilot, affecting policies and procedures that would influence military aviation for years to come. The challenge ahead involved translating her findings into actionable changes that could address the problems she had identified while overcoming the institutional resistance that inevitably accompanied challenges to established practices. The success of her efforts would depend on her ability to build support among decision-makers who had the authority to implement the changes necessary to address aircraft longevity concerns. Her elimination from pilot training, which had seemed like the end of her military aviation career, was revealing itself to be the beginning of a different kind of contribution that might ultimately prove more valuable than anything she could have accomplished in a cockpit. The methodical, analytical approach that had been criticized during flight training was exactly what military aviation needed to address problems that had been developing unnoticed for years. The emergency alert klaxon shattered the pre-dawn quiet at Whitmore Air Force Base, its urgent wail cutting through the Arctic wind like a blade. Sarah Thompson jolted awake in her maintenance quarters, immediately recognizing the specific pattern that indicated a flight emergency in progress. Years of agricultural flying had conditioned her to respond instantly to crisis situations, and she was pulling on her cold weather gear before the second alarm cycle completed. The Flight Operations Center was chaos when she arrived, drawn by the same instincts that had made her valuable in the maintenance analysis section. Radio chatter filled the air as controllers attempted to coordinate rescue efforts for a C-130 Hercules that had declared an in-flight emergency over the Alaskan wilderness. The aircraft, call sign Polar Bear 7, was carrying a high-priority delegation including 3 senators, 2 Pentagon officials, and a full crew complement, making the situation politically sensitive as well as operationally critical. Master Sergeant Johnson spotted her in the crowd of personnel gathering to monitor the emergency. "Thompson, what are you doing here?" "This is flight operations, not maintenance." "Sergeant, I heard the emergency alert and thought there might be something I could do to help." Sarah replied, her attention focused on the radio communications describing the aircraft's deteriorating condition. "What's the situation?" Colonel Hayes was coordinating the emergency response from the operations center, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation unfolding in real time. The C-130 had suffered multiple system failures during a routine transport mission, with initial reports indicating engine problems complicated by severe weather conditions that had developed unexpectedly over the flight route. "Polar Bear 7, this is Whitmore Operations," Hayes transmitted. "We're tracking your position and working on rescue coordination. What's your current status?" The pilot's voice crackled through the static tension evident despite his professional composure. "Whitmore Operations, Polar Bear 7. We've lost 2 engines and experiencing intermittent hydraulic pressure. Weather conditions are deteriorating rapidly, and we're having difficulty maintaining altitude. Request immediate assistance with emergency landing options." Sarah listened to the exchange while studying the weather displays and navigation charts spread across the operations center. Her agricultural flying experience had taught her to read weather patterns and terrain features in ways that might provide insights invisible to others focused on standard emergency procedures. The C-130's reported position placed it over some of the most unforgiving wilderness in Alaska, with limited options for emergency landings. Jake Mitchell appeared at the operations center, having been awakened by the emergency alert like other senior pilot candidates. His presence was officially justified by his advanced training status, but Sarah suspected he was more interested in observing a real emergency than contributing to its resolution. His confident demeanor suggested he viewed the situation as an opportunity to demonstrate his crisis management capabilities. "Colonel Hayes, I'd like to volunteer for any rescue mission you're planning," Jake announced. "I've got more Arctic flying experience than most of the candidates, and I'm current in multiple aircraft types. Hayes acknowledged Jake's offer, with a nod while continuing to monitor the radio communications from the distressed aircraft. The situation was evolving rapidly, with weather conditions complicating any potential rescue efforts, and the C-130's mechanical problems apparently worsening despite the crew's efforts to maintain control. Sarah found herself studying the large-scale navigation chart that showed the aircraft's approximate position relative to potential landing sites. Her familiarity with Arctic terrain features, gained through years of flying over similar wilderness areas in Montana, suggested possibilities that might not be immediately obvious to pilots trained primarily on established airfields and standard approach procedures. "Sergeant Johnson," she said quietly, "what do we know about Lake Fairchild?" "It's about 50 miles from the aircraft's last reported position." Johnson consulted the aeronautical chart and shook his head grimly. "Fairchild's a decent-sized lake, but it's completely frozen this time of year. Nobody's going to attempt a landing on questionable ice with an aircraft that heavy. What if the ice conditions were adequate?" Sarah pressed. "A C-130 has been designed for short-field operations, and the lake surface would provide a relatively smooth landing area if the ice could support the weight." The conversation was overheard by Captain Rodriguez, who had arrived to assist with emergency coordination. Her expression showed skepticism about suggestions coming from someone who had been eliminated from pilot training, but she was professional enough to consider any ideas that might help resolve the crisis. "Thompson, landing a 130,000-pound aircraft on lake ice would be incredibly dangerous even under perfect conditions," Rodriguez said. "We have no way to verify ice thickness or structural integrity, and the margin for error would be essentially zero." Sarah understood the objections but continued studying the chart, her mind racing through calculations based on her knowledge of aircraft performance and ice formation patterns. Lake Fairchild was large enough to provide adequate landing distance, and the current weather conditions suggested that ice formation had been occurring under ideal circumstances for the past several weeks. The radio crackled with another transmission. From Polar Bear 7, the pilot's voice now showing clear strain as the situation continued to deteriorate. "Whitmore operations. We're experiencing additional hydraulic problems and having difficulty maintaining directional control. Our altitude is decreasing, and we're running out of options for maintaining flight." Colonel Hayes consulted with his operations staff about available rescue resources, but the weather conditions were limiting helicopter operations, and the nearest suitable airfield was beyond the aircraft's remaining range given its mechanical problems. The situation was approaching the point where unconventional solutions might be the only alternatives to catastrophic loss of aircraft and passengers. "Sir," Sarah said, approaching Hayes with careful respect for military protocol, "I'd like to suggest Lake Fairchild as a potential emergency landing site. I know it sounds extreme, but the lake dimensions and ice conditions might make it feasible." Hayes looked at her with surprise, clearly wondering why a maintenance analyst was offering suggestions about emergency flight operations. "Thompson, lake ice landings are incredibly risky under the best circumstances. We're talking about lives here, not just aircraft." "I understand the risk, sir," Sarah replied, "but I've been analyzing aircraft performance data for months, and I think a C-130 could handle a lake landing if the approach was executed properly. The aircraft's short-field capabilities and robust landing gear design would give it advantages that other aircraft wouldn't have." Jake Mitchell overheard the exchange and couldn't resist inserting himself into the conversation. "With all due respect, Colonel, Thompson was eliminated from pilot training for good reasons. This isn't the time for experimental ideas from someone who couldn't handle standard flying procedures." The dismissal stung, but Sarah pressed forward with her analysis. "Sir, I've done extensive research on C-130 performance characteristics and Arctic ice formation patterns. Lake Fairchild has been frozen for over 6 weeks under ideal conditions, and the aircraft's weight could be distributed across multiple contact points if the landing technique were modified appropriately. Hayes found himself in the difficult position of evaluating suggestions from someone whose flying capabilities had been questioned, while dealing with an emergency that was rapidly eliminating conventional options. The C-130's deteriorating condition was forcing consideration of alternatives that would normally be rejected as too dangerous to attempt. Thompson, what specific modifications to landing technique are you suggesting? Hayes asked, his question indicating that he was taking her analysis more seriously than Jake's dismissive comments might have warranted. Sarah moved to the chart table and began explaining her reasoning, drawing on knowledge gained from both her agricultural flying background and her recent analysis of aircraft performance data. Sir, the key would be approaching at minimum controllable airspeed to reduce impact forces, using maximum flap configuration to minimize touchdown speed, and selecting a touchdown point that maximizes available stopping distance. She traced the lake's dimensions on the chart while continuing her explanation. The lake's orientation provides natural wind alignment for most weather conditions, and the surface regularity would eliminate the terrain variables that complicate most off-airport landings. The main risk factors would be ice thickness and hidden obstacles, but satellite imagery suggests clear surface conditions. Captain Rodriguez was studying Sarah's analysis with growing interest, recognizing technical competence despite her reservations about the source. The approach profile you're describing would require exceptional precision and aircraft control, especially given the C-130's current mechanical problems. That's exactly why it might work, Sarah replied. C-130s are designed for rough field operations, and the pilots would have better control authority than they would attempting to reach a conventional runway with their current system failures. The radio transmitted another urgent message from Polar Bear 7, with the pilot reporting that hydraulic pressure was continuing to decline and that normal landing procedures might not be possible even if they could reach a prepared runway. The mechanical problems were eliminating conventional options faster than rescue coordination could provide alternatives. Colonel Hayes made the command decision that would change everything. Operations, contact Polar Bear 7 and provide them with Lake Fairchild coordinates and approach information. Advise them that it's an unconventional landing site with significant risks, but it may be their best option given current circumstances. The transmission went out over emergency frequencies, with detailed information about lake dimensions, estimated ice conditions, and suggested approach procedures. The C-130 pilot acknowledged the information with professional calm that masked what must have been tremendous stress about attempting a landing that no military pilot had ever been trained to execute. Whitmore Operations, Polar Bear 7. We're proceeding toward Lake Fairchild coordinates and will attempt the emergency landing as described. Request that you maintain radio contact and coordinate emergency response assets for the landing site. Sarah found herself thrust into an unprecedented role as Hayes directed her to provide technical support for the emergency landing attempt. Her analysis of C-130 performance characteristics and Arctic conditions had evolved from theoretical maintenance research into critical operational guidance for a life-or-death situation. Thompson, I need you to calculate optimal approach speeds and landing configurations based on current weather conditions and estimated aircraft weight, Hayes ordered. The pilots need specific performance data to execute this safely. Working quickly with flight manuals and performance charts, Sarah developed detailed landing recommendations that accounted for the C-130's mechanical problems and the unique challenges of a lake ice landing. Her calculations indicated that the approach was technically feasible but would require precise execution within very narrow margins for error. Jake Mitchell watched the proceedings with obvious discomfort, clearly struggling to accept that someone he had consistently dismissed was now providing critical guidance for a major emergency. His confidence in military aviation hierarchy was being challenged by the reality that technical competence mattered more than training credentials when lives were at stake. The flight to Lake Fairchild took 45 minutes, during which Sarah provided continuous radio support to help the C-130 pilots prepare for their unprecedented landing attempt. Her guidance covered everything from approach speeds to touchdown technique, drawing on knowledge that combined her agricultural flying experience with detailed understanding of C-130 systems and capabilities. Weather conditions at the lake were marginal but acceptable, with visibility sufficient for visual approach and winds that favored the lake's natural orientation. The pilots reported that they could see the lake surface and were beginning their approach according to Sarah's recommendations. Polar Bear 7, final approach Lake Fairchild, came the pilot's voice, steady despite the enormous pressure of attempting a landing that could save or doom everyone aboard. We're configured for landing and following the approach profile as recommended. Sarah monitored the radio while tracking the aircraft's progress on radar, her heart pounding as she realized that her analysis was being tested under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. Everything she had learned about aircraft performance and Arctic conditions was being validated or disproven by an emergency landing that would determine the fate of 43 people. The touchdown was perfect, with the C-130 settling onto the lake ice at precisely the speed and configuration Sarah had calculated. The aircraft's weight distributed across its robust landing gear exactly as her analysis had predicted, and the ice surface provided the smooth landing roll that made the unconventional approach successful. Whitmore Operations, Polar Bear 7. On the ground, Lake Fairchild, the pilot transmitted, relief evident in his voice despite professional restraint. Aircraft and passengers are safe. The landing surface performed exactly as predicted. Request emergency response coordination for passenger evacuation and aircraft recovery. The operations center erupted in cheers and congratulations as the successful landing was confirmed. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and vindication that was unlike anything she had experienced during her military aviation career. Her analysis had been proven correct under the most demanding circumstances possible, saving lives and aircraft through the same methodical approach that had been criticized during her flight training. Colonel Hayes approached her with an expression that combined respect with acknowledgement of fundamental misjudgment. "Thompson, your analysis made the difference between a successful rescue and a catastrophic loss. The precision of your calculations and the accuracy of your predictions demonstrated exactly the kind of expertise we need in military aviation." Master Sergeant Johnson was beaming with pride at Sarah's accomplishment, recognizing that her unique combination of flying experience and analytical skills had produced results that no one else could have achieved. "Thompson, you just proved that understanding aircraft systems and performance characteristics is just as important as traditional flying skills." Jake Mitchell's reaction was more complex, reflecting the challenge to his worldview that Sarah's success represented. "I have to admit," he said with visible effort, "that was incredible analysis and guidance. I don't think any of us could have calculated those parameters or provided that level of technical support." The successful Lake Fairchild landing became a case study in crisis management and the value of diverse expertise in military aviation. Sarah's contribution was recognized not just as technical competence, but as the kind of innovative problem-solving that saved lives when conventional approaches were inadequate. The aftermath of the emergency brought fundamental changes to pilot training philosophy at Whitmore Air Force Base. Sarah's demonstrated expertise led to her reinstatement as a pilot candidate, but more importantly, it sparked comprehensive review of training methods that had emphasized speed over analytical capability. Her unique perspective as someone who understood both flying operations and aircraft systems made her invaluable for developing new training approaches that balanced quick decision-making with thorough analysis. The methodical approach that had been criticized during her initial training, was recognized as essential for handling complex emergencies that required innovative solutions. The rescue operation's success led to Sarah's assignment as a special instructor for emergency procedures and unconventional operations. Her role involved teaching other pilots the analytical skills necessary for solving problems that didn't fit standard procedures, drawing on the same systematic approach that had made the Lake Fairchild landing possible. Jake Mitchell's evolution from critic to student was one of the most significant changes resulting from the emergency. His natural flying abilities remained valuable, but he began developing the analytical skills that Sarah's example had shown were essential for handling complex situations that required more than quick reflexes and aggressive flying. The aircraft performance analysis that had led to Sarah's discoveries about training methods received renewed attention following the successful emergency landing. Her identification of relationships between flying techniques and aircraft longevity was validated by independent studies, leading to modifications in training procedures throughout military aviation. The transformation was complete when Sarah received orders assigning her to the Pentagon's Aircraft Performance Analysis Division, where her expertise would influence military aviation policy at the highest levels. The methodical approach that had been dismissed by multiple training programs was now recognized as exactly what military aviation needed for addressing complex technical challenges. The Lake Fairchild landing had proven that sometimes the person everyone gives up on is exactly the person everyone needs when conventional solutions aren't adequate. Sarah's journey from failed pilot candidate to recognized expert demonstrated that different approaches to aviation had value that might not be apparent until crisis situations revealed their importance. Years later, the emergency landing procedures developed from Sarah's analysis were incorporated into standard military aviation training, ensuring that future pilots would be prepared for unconventional situations that required analytical thinking rather than just aggressive flying. Her contribution had changed military aviation in ways that extended far beyond a single emergency landing. The frozen lake that had seemed like an impossible landing site became a symbol of what could be accomplished when analytical expertise was properly valued and applied. Sarah's careful calculations had transformed a potential catastrophe into a successful rescue, proving that methodical preparation and systematic analysis were as important as quick decision-making in military aviation. Her story became an inspiration for others who didn't fit traditional pilot profiles, demonstrating that military aviation needed diverse expertise and varied approaches to address the complex challenges of modern flight operations. The person who had been told she wasn't suitable for military flying had ultimately redefined what military aviation could accomplish. The C-130 that had landed on Lake Fairchild was eventually recovered and returned to service, carrying a plaque commemorating the emergency landing that had saved 43 lives through innovative problem-solving and precise technical analysis. Sarah's contribution was permanently recognized as an example of how unconventional expertise could produce extraordinary results when applied to seemingly impossible challenges. The Flight Evaluation Board convened at 0800 hours sharp, their stern faces reflecting the gravity of Sarah Thompson's situation. 3 consecutive training failures had brought her to this moment, where a panel of senior officers would determine whether she deserved one final opportunity or if her military aviation career was truly over. The conference room felt like a courtroom, with fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across the polished table where her fate would be decided. Colonel Hayes presided over the proceedings with the detached professionalism of someone who had seen countless pilot candidates reach this crossroads. To his left sat Captain Rodriguez, whose expression revealed nothing about her thoughts on Sarah's prospects. Major Williams from Flight Standards occupied the third chair, his reputation for uncompromising evaluation standards making him the most intimidating member of the panel. Sarah entered the room wearing her dress uniform, the weight of failure hanging around her shoulders like an invisible cloak. Her service record lay open before the board members, documenting every mistake, every hesitation, every moment where her methodical approach had been judged inadequate for military aviation requirements. The contrast between her appearance and Jake Mitchell's confident bearing during his recent evaluation was stark and unmistakable. "Specialist Thompson," Colonel Hayes began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions about people's careers. "You've been given more opportunities than most candidates receive, and your performance has consistently fallen short of our standards. This board has convened to determine whether additional training would be beneficial, or if your separation from the program serves everyone's best interests." The words hit Sarah like physical blows, each phrase reinforcing the pattern of disappointment that had defined her military aviation experience. She had prepared for this moment, knowing that her analytical approach and methodical flying style would be scrutinized one final time by people who valued quick decision-making above all other qualities. Captain Rodriguez consulted her notes before speaking, her tone professional but not unkind. "Your technical knowledge is exceptional, and your understanding of aircraft systems exceeds that of most instructor pilots. However, your consistent inability to make rapid decisions under pressure represents a fundamental incompatibility with combat aviation requirements." Major Williams nodded in agreement before adding his own assessment. "Military pilots must be capable of split-second decision-making when lives depend on immediate action. Your tendency to analyze situations thoroughly before acting might be valuable in some contexts, but it's potentially fatal in combat environments where hesitation kills." Sarah listened to their evaluation while reflecting on the countless hours she had spent trying to conform to expectations that seemed fundamentally at odds with her natural approach to flying. Every instructor had emphasized the same priorities: speed over deliberation, aggression over caution, quick reaction over careful analysis. The message was consistent and clear. Her way of thinking didn't belong in military aviation. "Colonel Hayes," Sarah said, requesting permission to speak, "I understand that my approach doesn't match traditional military aviation preferences, but I believe there's value in methodical analysis that hasn't been properly recognized by this program." Hayes gestured for her to continue, though his expression suggested skepticism about anything she might say to change the board's assessment of her suitability for pilot training. "My agricultural flying background taught me that thorough preparation and systematic problem-solving often prevent emergencies that require split-second decision-making," Sarah explained. "While quick reactions are important, understanding aircraft systems and environmental conditions deeply enough to avoid critical situations might be equally valuable." Major Williams interrupted with barely concealed impatience. "Thompson, we're not training agricultural pilots here. Combat aviation requires aggressive tactics and immediate responses to threats that don't allow time for extended analysis. Your approach might work for crop dusting, but it's inadequate for military operations." The dismissal was familiar and demoralizing, reinforcing Sarah's growing understanding that her perspective would never be valued within the existing military aviation culture. The board members seemed to view her analytical approach as a fundamental character flaw rather than a different but potentially valuable way of approaching flying challenges. Captain Rodriguez leaned forward with what appeared to be genuine concern. "Thompson, your dedication to aviation is obvious, and your technical competence is impressive. However, pilot training isn't just about individual capability. It's about developing officers who can lead others in high-stress environments, where quick decision-making is essential for mission success." "I appreciate that perspective, ma'am," Sarah replied, "but I wonder if the emphasis on speed might sometimes compromise the quality of decisions being made." My analysis suggests that some training accidents might be prevented by encouraging more thorough situation assessment before taking action. The comment touched on a sensitive subject, given recent concerns about training accident rates and their relationship to the program's aggressive training philosophy. Colonel Hayes exchanged glances with his fellow board members, clearly uncomfortable, with suggestions that their training methods might be contributing to safety problems. Thompson, training accidents are investigated thoroughly, and our procedures are based on decades of experience in developing combat-ready pilots. Hayes responded with obvious irritation. Your critique of our methods is inappropriate and demonstrates exactly the kind of second-guessing that makes you unsuitable for military aviation leadership. The rebuke was sharp and final, effectively ending any possibility that Sarah's concerns about training philosophy would receive serious consideration. The board's body language indicated that they had reached their decision and were merely completing the formalities required before delivering their verdict. Master Sergeant Johnson entered the conference room at that moment, carrying a folder that he handed to Colonel Hayes with unusual urgency. "Sir, there's been a development that might be relevant to this proceeding. We've received preliminary findings from the Aircraft Accident Investigation Board regarding last month's training incident." Hayes opened the folder and scanned its contents, his expression shifting from irritation to concern as he read the investigator's conclusions. Captain Rodriguez and Major Williams waited silently while their commander absorbed information that was clearly significant and potentially troubling. "According to this report," Hayes said slowly, "the Accident Investigation Board has identified pilot decision-making speed as a contributing factor in the T-38 incident that resulted in significant aircraft damage. The pilot's rapid response to a simulated emergency led to improper configuration that exacerbated the situation rather than resolving it. The revelation hung in the air like an accusation, challenging the fundamental assumptions about pilot training that had shaped the board's assessment of Sarah's capabilities. The investigation findings suggested that the aggressive decision-making philosophy they championed might have contributed to exactly the kind of accident that proper analysis could have prevented. Sarah felt a mixture of vindication and sadness as the implications became clear. Her concerns about the relationship between training philosophy and safety outcomes were being validated by official investigation findings, but the validation came at the cost of an accident that could have been prevented through more careful analysis. Major Williams studied the accident report with obvious discomfort, recognizing that its conclusions undermined his previous criticisms of Sarah's methodical approach. "The investigation findings are concerning, but they don't necessarily invalidate our training methods. One incident doesn't establish a pattern or justify fundamental changes to proven procedures." "With respect, sir," Sarah said, seizing the opportunity to present her analysis, "I've been conducting my own review of training incidents and maintenance records. The data suggests that there might indeed be a pattern connecting aggressive decision-making with preventable accidents and increased aircraft wear." Colonel Hayes looked up from the accident report with new interest, clearly recognizing that Sarah's analysis might provide insights relevant to the safety concerns raised by the investigation. "What specific patterns have you identified, and what's the basis for your conclusions?" Sarah pulled out her detailed notebook, the same worn leather-bound book that had been mocked during her initial arrival at Whitmore Air Force Base. Its pages were filled with meticulously documented observations and calculations that represented months of careful analysis and systematic data collection. "Sir, I've been tracking correlations between pilot decision-making styles and various outcome measures including accident rates, maintenance requirements, and mission effectiveness," Sarah explained, opening her notebook to charts and graphs that illustrated her findings. "The data indicates that pilots who take slightly more time for situation assessment actually achieve better overall results." She walked the board through her methodology and findings, demonstrating statistical relationships that challenged conventional wisdom about the superiority of rapid decision-making in all situations. Her analysis was thorough and compelling, backed by objective data that was difficult to dismiss as opinion or speculation. Captain Rodriguez examined the charts with growing interest, recognizing the sophistication of Sarah's analytical approach and the potential significance of her conclusions. This analysis suggests that our emphasis on decision-making speed might be creating unintended consequences that affect both safety and operational effectiveness. Major Williams remained skeptical, but was clearly struggling to find flaws in Sarah's methodology or conclusions. Even if these correlations exist, they don't necessarily prove causation. There could be other factors that explain the relationships you've identified. That's absolutely correct, sir, Sarah acknowledged. However, the statistical significance of the correlations suggests that further investigation would be warranted. At minimum, the data indicates that methodical decision-making approaches shouldn't be automatically dismissed as inferior to rapid response methods. The board members found themselves in the unexpected position of reconsidering fundamental assumptions about pilot training based on analysis from someone they had been prepared to eliminate from the program. Sarah's systematic approach to data collection and interpretation was demonstrating exactly the kind of thorough thinking that she had been criticized for lacking. Colonel Hayes closed the accident investigation report and looked directly at Sarah with an expression that suggested fundamental recalculation of her value to the program. Thompson, your analysis raises important questions about our training methods and their effectiveness. I'm postponing this evaluation board pending further review of your findings and their implications for program modification. The decision was unprecedented in Sarah's experience with military aviation bureaucracy. Instead of being dismissed for failing to meet established standards, she was being asked to contribute to a fundamental reassessment of what those standards should be and how they should be applied. Master Sergeant Johnson smiled with obvious satisfaction at the turn of events, recognizing that Sarah's persistence and analytical capabilities were finally receiving the recognition they deserved. Colonel, if I may suggest, Thompson's unique perspective as both a pilot candidate and a systems analyst might be valuable for developing improved training approaches. The suggestion resonated with board members who were beginning to understand that Sarah's supposed weaknesses might actually represent strengths that the program needed to incorporate rather than eliminate. Her methodical approach and systematic thinking were exactly what was required for addressing complex problems that couldn't be solved through quick reactions alone. Captain Rodriguez proposed a radical departure from standard procedures. Sir, I recommend that we modify Thompson's training program to focus on developing her strengths rather than trying to force her into a mold that doesn't fit her capabilities. Her analytical skills could be valuable for instructor development and training program improvement. The proposal represented a fundamental shift in thinking about pilot development, acknowledging that different approaches to aviation might have value within military operations, rather than representing character flaws that needed to be corrected. Sarah's case was becoming a catalyst for broader changes in how the program identified and developed pilot candidates. Major Williams found himself reluctantly agreeing with his colleague's assessment. The accident investigation findings and Thompson's analysis suggest that we might benefit from incorporating more diverse thinking styles into our pilot development process. Her systematic approach could complement rather than conflict with traditional military aviation values. The transformation in the board's perspective was remarkable, reflecting a willingness to question established practices when presented with compelling evidence that those practices might be suboptimal. Sarah's persistence in maintaining her analytical approach despite consistent criticism was proving to be exactly what the program needed for addressing previously unrecognized problems. Colonel Hayes made the decision that would change everything. Thompson, I'm reassigning you to a special project developing new training methodologies that incorporate Systematic analysis with traditional pilot development. Your role will be to help us understand how different thinking styles can contribute to safer and more effective military aviation. The assignment was unlike anything Sarah had imagined possible when she first arrived at Whitmore Air Force Base with her worn equipment and agricultural flying background. Instead of being forced to abandon her methodical approach, she was being asked to develop it into a formal contribution to military aviation training. The months that followed brought intensive collaboration with aircraft manufacturers, safety investigators, and training specialists from across the military aviation community. Sarah's analysis was expanded and refined, ultimately producing a comprehensive assessment of training methodologies and their relationships to operational outcomes. Her findings confirmed that the most effective pilots combined quick reaction capabilities with systematic analysis skills, using each approach as appropriate for specific situations, rather than relying exclusively on either rapid decision-making or extended deliberation. The research validated her intuition that different thinking styles had complementary value in military aviation. Jake Mitchell's reaction to Sarah's new role was complex, reflecting his struggle to reconcile her success with his previous assumptions about pilot qualifications and training requirements. His natural flying abilities remained valuable, but he began developing appreciation for the analytical approach that Sarah represented. "I have to admit," Jake told her during one of their collaborative training sessions, "that your systematic approach to problem solving has helped me understand aircraft systems and emergency procedures in ways that I never learned through traditional training methods." The acknowledgement was significant, representing a fundamental shift in Jake's understanding of what constituted valuable pilot capabilities. His confidence in his natural abilities remained intact, but it was now complemented by recognition that other approaches to aviation had merit and could enhance rather than threaten his own competence. The training program modifications that emerged from Sarah's research were implemented gradually, incorporating systematic analysis components into traditional pilot development without abandoning the quick decision-making skills that remained essential for combat operations. The balanced approach produced pilots who were both analytically capable and tactically aggressive when appropriate. Sarah's transformation from failed pilot candidate to recognized expert in training methodology became a case study in the value of persistence and the importance of recognizing diverse capabilities within military aviation. Her methodical approach, which had been consistently criticized as a weakness, was ultimately recognized as exactly what the program needed for addressing complex safety and effectiveness challenges. The emergency that would test all of these developments was still months away, hidden in the future like a storm building beyond the horizon. When it finally arrived, Sarah's analytical capabilities and systematic approach to problem-solving would prove essential for saving lives in a situation that no amount of quick thinking could resolve through conventional methods. Her position as a training methodology specialist provided her with comprehensive understanding of aircraft capabilities and performance characteristics that would prove crucial when innovation and precise calculation became the only alternatives to catastrophic failure. The methodical preparation that had been dismissed as overthinking would become the foundation for achieving the impossible. The lake landing that would ultimately validate her approach was still an unknown challenge waiting in the Alaskan wilderness. When that moment arrived, Sarah's careful analysis and systematic problem-solving would transform what appeared to be an impossible situation into a successful rescue that saved 43 lives through the same methodical thinking that had nearly ended her aviation career. The irony was perfect and complete. The person who had been told she was too slow and too cautious for military aviation would ultimately use those exact qualities to accomplish something that no traditionally trained pilot could have achieved. Her failure to fit the conventional mold would prove to be precisely what was needed when conventional approaches were inadequate. Years later, Military aviation training programs throughout the world would incorporate the balanced methodology that Sarah developed. Recognizing that the most effective pilots combined multiple thinking styles rather than relying exclusively on either rapid reaction or extended analysis. Her contribution changed how military aviation understood and developed pilot capabilities. The worn notebook that had accompanied her through failure and eventual success was preserved as a symbol of the value of persistent analysis and systematic observation. Its pages contained the foundation for training approaches that would influence military aviation for decades, proving that sometimes the most important contributions come from people who don't fit traditional expectations. The transformation was complete when Sarah received assignment to lead the Air Force's Pilot Development Research Division, where her expertise would influence training standards and methodologies across all aircraft types and operational environments. The methodical approach that had been consistently criticized was now recognized as essential for addressing the complex challenges of modern military aviation. Her story became an inspiration for others who approached aviation differently, demonstrating that military services needed diverse thinking styles and varied, problem-solving approaches to address the full spectrum of challenges they faced. The person who didn't fit the traditional pilot profile had ultimately redefined what military aviation could accomplish through systematic analysis and careful preparation. The lake landing that would eventually make her famous was still waiting in the future, but the foundation for that success had been laid through years of persistence, analysis, and refusal to abandon her natural approach to solving complex problems. When the moment came to prove that different didn't mean inferior, Sarah would be ready with exactly the skills that everyone had told her were inadequate for military aviation. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.